Imagine being executed not once, but twice. It sounds impossible, right? But one man's punishment was so extreme, so bizarre, that it felt like they killed him after he was already dead. This is the mind-blowing true story of John Bellingham, the only person to ever assassinate a British Prime Minister, and the man who faced a fate darker than anyone could have imagined. Welcome to a tale of desperation, revenge, and a very strange kind of justice. Today we're diving into the strange death of John Bellingham, a story from 1812 that's as dramatic as any thriller. Why should you care about something that happened over 200 years ago? Because this story is more than just history. It's a shocking reminder of how far someone will go when they feel wronged, and how society can respond in ways that make us question our own humanity. By the end of this video, you'll see how one man's quest for justice turned into a nightmare, and what that means for all of us in understanding the consequences of extreme actions. Now, let's set the stage. It's early evening on May 11th, 1812. We're in London, inside the lobby of the House of Commons. Politicians and lords bustle about, and right in the middle of it all walks Prime Minister Spencer Perceval. He's the leader of Britain, the most powerful man in the country at that moment. Suddenly, bang! A gunshot echoes through the hall. Perceval staggers, a look of shock on his face. He collapses to the floor, blood spreading across his chest, soaking through his waistcoat. Panic erupts instantly. People realize what just happened. Someone in the crowd yells that the Prime Minister has been shot. Chaos. Ministers and spectators rush toward the fallen leader, who is now gasping for breath on the cold marble tiles. As Perceval lies dying, yes, the Prime Minister of Britain is bleeding out on the floor of Parliament. A man calmly sits down on a bench nearby. He doesn't run. He doesn't even try to hide the pistol he's just used. He's just sitting there, eerily composed amid the screaming and confusion. That man is John Bellingham. He's not a foreign spy or a crazed anarchist. He's an ordinary Englishman in a business suit. And he has just fired the fatal shot that changed British history. By the way, this remains the only time a British Prime Minister has ever been assassinated. Guards and bystanders quickly seize Bellingham. He offers no resistance whatsoever. In fact, witnesses later say he was strangely calm, and even remarked that he felt justified in what he had done. Imagine that. The most important person in government is dying at his feet, and the killer is utterly at ease, convinced he had every right to pull the trigger. It's chilling. The news of this assassination spreads like wildfire. The whole nation is in shock, their Prime Minister murdered in the halls of Parliament. Yet, here's an even stranger twist. Not everyone is upset. Spencer Perceval had been a pretty unpopular leader among the poor and working class. So, when word got out that he was dead, some ordinary people actually cheered. There were reports of crowds toasting the assassin's health in taverns. It sounds unbelievable, but many folks who suffered under Perceval's policies felt a sneaky bit of satisfaction at his demise. Of course, the British authorities were horrified by the assassination and by this reaction. They knew they needed to respond with the toughest justice imaginable. John Bellingham was about to face the full wrath of the state, and fast. But who exactly was John Bellingham, and why did he do something so unthinkable? To find out, we need to rewind a few years and see what drove this man to such a desperate act. John Bellingham wasn't always a notorious figure. In fact, he started off as a fairly normal guy. Born around 1769, he built a life as a merchant, basically a businessman involved in trade. In the early 1800s, Bellingham went off to Russia for a business venture, and that's where his troubles truly began. Through no fault of his own, at least according to him, he got tangled up in a local scandal. A Russian trading company accused him of a debt he claimed he didn't owe. Things escalated, and before he knew it, Bellingham was thrown into a Russian prison. He ended up rotting in a jail cell in Russia for 5 long years. Just try to picture that. You're in a foreign prison, stuck on bogus charges, your business back home collapsing, your wife and family left destitute, and your own country's officials aren't helping you at all. It's the kind of experience that could break anyone's mind. By the time Bellingham was finally released and allowed to return to England in 1809, he was a changed man. He had lost his fortune, his reputation was ruined, and he was burning with a sense of injustice. He genuinely believed the British government had abandoned him, that it was their duty to save him from that Russian ordeal, and they failed. So he started petitioning the government for compensation. He wrote letters, filed complaints, tried to get appointments with officials, even with Prime Minister Perceval himself. But every attempt he made was brushed off or ignored. The government was tied up with the Napoleonic Wars and domestic issues. One man's personal grievance just wasn't a priority for them. Can you imagine the frustration? Bellingham certainly could. Every door he knocked on was slammed in his face. As months went by with no acknowledgement of his suffering, his anger turned into something dark and obsessive. He felt he had been wronged in the worst way, and yet no one would listen. It's like he was invisible to those in power, and it ate at him day and night. Desperation does strange things to people. In John Bellingham's case, it lit a fuse that would lead to murder. He eventually convinced himself that drastic action was his only option. If the government wouldn't give him justice, he would force justice upon them in the most extreme way. Bellingham went out and bought 2 pistols. He practiced shooting, preparing himself for what he was planning to do. He even warned a few people about his intentions, hinting that he might eliminate a high-ranking official to get revenge for his mistreatment. Most folks didn't take these warnings seriously at the time, but Bellingham was deadly serious. He decided that the target of his wrath would be the head of the government, Spencer Perceval, the Prime Minister who he felt had personally snubbed him. And so, in May 1812, John Bellingham traveled to London with a pistol in his coat pocket and vengeance on his mind. We already saw what happened next. He confronted Perceval in the lobby of Parliament and shot him at point-blank range. In Bellingham's mind, this was not a senseless murder. It was him finally getting what he saw as justice after years of being ignored and mistreated. Of course, to everyone else, it was a horrifying act of violence. The deed was done, and now Bellingham would have to answer for it. The British establishment moved almost as fast as Bellingham's bullet. They were determined to make an example out of him, to show that no matter what your grievances, you cannot just kill the Prime Minister and get away with it. The trial was arranged with lightning speed. Just 4 days after the assassination, 4 days, John Bellingham was hauled before a judge at the Old Bailey Courthouse on May 15, 1812. Inside that courtroom, Bellingham remained unnervingly composed. He showed no remorse. In fact, he calmly explained to the court his reasons, basically repeating that he had been horribly wronged and that in his view, taking Perceval's life was a regrettable but necessary act to draw attention to his plight. His lawyers, seeing that this was essentially a confession, tried to plead insanity on his behalf. They knew it was his only sliver of a chance to avoid the death penalty. But Bellingham wouldn't have it. He flat out rejected the insanity defense. He insisted he knew exactly what he was doing, even proclaiming that he would rather suffer death 100 times over than continue to endure the injustices he had faced. That is how strongly he felt about what he saw as his righteous cause. Unsurprisingly, the jury didn't sympathize. How could they? A man was dead, the Prime Minister no less, and the killer was standing there acting like it was all justified. It took the jury only about 15 minutes to decide the verdict. Guilty of murder, there was no doubt, and the punishment, death. But the judge's sentence went further than that. He pronounced that John Bellingham would be hanged by the neck until dead, and that his body would be dissected afterward. This wasn't some random cruel add-on. It was actually part of the legal punishment for murder at that time in England. They wanted to deny infamous criminals a proper burial and use their bodies for medical science, almost as an extra humiliation. Basically, the judge's message was this: they weren't only going to kill him, they were going to make sure even his corpse didn't get to rest in peace. Bellingham heard this sentence and accepted it with the same eerie calm he'd shown all along. No outbursts, no begging for mercy. He simply nodded to the judge. He even used his final moments in court to ask that the public should take care of his wife and children after he was gone. And in a strange way, that actually happened. People donated quite a bit of money to support his family, perhaps out of sympathy or guilt. Just 3 days later, the execution day arrived, May 18th, 1812, exactly 1 week since Spencer Perceval's murder. In those days, executions were public spectacles, and boy, did this one draw a crowd. Thousands of Londoners packed the area outside Newgate Prison at dawn, all eager to witness the hanging of the man who killed the Prime Minister. It was like the biggest show in town. Some people even climbed onto rooftops and lampposts to get a better view. Vendors were selling food and pamphlets about the assassination. It was almost like a grim fairground. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, John Bellingham was led out from his cell to the gallows erected just outside the prison gates. The gallows was basically a wooden platform with a trap door and a sturdy rope dangling from a beam. Bellingham stepped up, his hands bound, the noose waiting for him. I can only imagine what must have been going through his mind at that moment. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. Reports from witnesses say that Bellingham appeared composed even when the hangman placed the noose around his neck and tightened it. He didn't give a final speech or dramatic last words. The most he did was maybe mumble a prayer under his breath. Then, with a signal, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor beneath Bellingham's feet swung open, and he dropped suddenly through the hole. The rope snapped taut with a loud crack, jolting his body to a stop. For a few seconds, he writhed and twitched at the end of the rope, his legs kicking in the air, his whole weight jerking as the noose strangled him. A hush fell over the crowd as they watched the life being choked out of him. His face turned purple, his eyes bulging and tongue protruding grotesquely. This was not a quick, merciful death. It was a slow, agonizing strangulation. After about 2 or 3 minutes, John Bellingham's movements stopped. He hung there, limp and lifeless. The man who had demanded justice in the most violent way was dead, swaying slightly as the morning sun rose over London. Usually, that's where a story like this would end, with the criminal's lifeless body hanging as the crowd disperses. But in this case, it was far from over. Remember that special add-on to Bellingham's sentence, the dissection? Well, the authorities were about to carry it out, and it would become perhaps the most gruesome part of this whole saga. John Bellingham's lifeless body was cut down from the gallows after hanging for an hour to ensure he was really dead. Instead of being delivered to his family for burial, his corpse was handed over to science, literally. A horse-drawn cart carried his body to a nearby medical facility, most likely the Royal College of Surgeons, where a team of doctors and anatomy students were waiting. This was a common fate for executed murderers in that era. Their bodies were used for medical research and teaching. But what happened to Bellingham went beyond a simple anatomy lesson. It turned into something almost out of a horror novel. Picture a cold, stark dissection room in 1812. Perhaps it's lit by oil lamps or candles, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The air smells of a mix of blood, tobacco, and spirits, both the drinking kind and the preservative alcohol used in specimens. John Bellingham's body is laid out on a wooden table. The crowd outside may have gone home, but a new, smaller audience in white aprons gathers around. Surgeons and students, ready to uncover whatever secrets the assassin's body might hold. A senior surgeon takes a scalpel and makes the first cut. The blade slices into Bellingham's chest, and dark, clotted blood oozes out. Skin and muscle are peeled back. The surgeon methodically saws open the ribcage, crack, and lifts off a section of bone to reveal the organs within. Heart, lungs, stomach, liver, all of it now exposed to curious eyes. They remove each organ, examining it, passing it around perhaps, noting any abnormalities. It was recorded that Bellingham's stomach contained a small amount of fluid that smelled like wine. Maybe he had a stiff drink before his execution to steady his nerves. His bladder was completely empty. He probably hadn't relieved himself recently, which isn't surprising given the stress of awaiting death. They noted that his brain looked perfectly normal. There was no visible defect to explain his actions. And in a rather embarrassing observation, they even recorded that Bellingham's body showed signs of a natural post-mortem reaction that sometimes happens in hangings, a kind of involuntary arousal. It turns out that when the neck is constricted during hanging, it can trigger that reaction in the body, a final, bizarre twitch of the human nerves. The dissection of John Bellingham was thorough, basically a second execution, but this time carried out with scalpels and saws. Yet even after cutting him open and inspecting everything, the doctors weren't done. This was the age of scientific experimentation with electricity and the boundaries of life and death. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein would be written just a few years later, inspired by real experiments of the time. And now, Bellingham's fresh corpse became the subject of such an experiment. The surgeons wanted to see if they could stimulate his organs to show signs of life after death. According to reports from the day, they achieved a rather horrifying success. Bellingham's heart was made to continue beatings for nearly 4 hours after he died. You heard that correctly. His heart, removed from his body, kept twitching and contracting as if it was still alive for hours, right there on the table. Whether by manual massage or some early form of electrical galvanism, primitive electric shock, they managed to wring a last bit of motion out of that dead heart. It was as if John Bellingham's dark, angry heart refused to stop even after the hangman had done his job. This gruesome spectacle wasn't open to the public, thankfully, but news of it did get out. People were both fascinated and appalled. In fact, the dissection and the almost ghoulish experiments on Bellingham's body caused such a stir that it led to reforms. The Royal College of Surgeons, embarrassed by how sensational this had become, put in place new rules to ensure that future dissections of executed criminals would be more private and dignified. No more turning a dissection into a Frankenstein-esque show. Ironically, even in death, John Bellingham influenced changes in society, albeit in a very niche area of medical ethics. Once the surgeons had finished their examination, what remained of Bellingham was disposed of. His body was eventually given to an anatomist named Edward Stanley for a quiet burial. Bellingham's story faded into history, but not entirely. One part of him, quite literally, still survives to this day: his skull. Yes, the surgeons decided to keep John Bellingham's skull as a specimen. Perhaps they found it historically significant, the skull of the man who killed a prime minister. Or perhaps they wanted to study it for any signs of lunacy. Phrenology, the study of skull shapes, was a popular pseudoscience in the 19th century. Whatever the reason, his skull was preserved, and today it sits in a glass case at a pathology museum in London. If you ever saw it, it would look like any old skull until you read the label and realize you're face to face with the remains of one of history's most startling criminals. So ends the strange tale of John Bellingham, the man they executed twice. First, he met his fate at the end of a rope, and then his body was subjected to a second ordeal under the knife. It's a dark, cautionary tale from history. What can we learn from it? For one, it underscores how desperation and obsession can drive an ordinary person to commit an act of extraordinary evil. Bellingham convinced himself that violence was the only way to get justice, but in the end, it brought nothing but destruction. A family without a husband and father, a country robbed of its leader, and Bellingham himself destroyed in body and legacy. This story also makes us reflect on justice and punishment. The way society dealt with Bellingham, executing him swiftly and then mutilating his corpse, feels shockingly harsh to us now, and it should. It reminds us how much our values have evolved. Today we expect even the worst criminals to be treated with basic humanity. Back then, they literally cut up a man's body to send a message. Was it effective? Maybe. But it's a part of history we can hardly imagine living through now. In the end, John Bellingham's name is a footnote in the history books, overshadowed by the famous man he killed. Yet his story is unforgettable. It shows that truth can be stranger and darker than fiction. And it warns us about the extremes of human anger and retribution. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this incredible story. If you found this video eye-opening or intriguing, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable tales from history. I've got plenty more dark and fascinating stories lined up, and you won't want to miss them. Let me know in the comments what you think about John Bellingham's fate. Was there anything that surprised you the most? And if you have a suggestion for another historical story you'd like to see covered, share that too. Once again, thank you for staying with me till the end. Until next time, stay curious and remember that history has many lessons to teach us, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. See you in the next video.